Finally, I was able to hit play and walk around in the scene I had drawn in Procreate the previous day, which again was such a surreal experience to bring a piece of my imagination to life. So, you know how we started last episode with a peaceful monologue and a montage of me preparing a soothing cup of coffee? Well, today we're starting with some devastating news. For those of you who are just jumping into our journey, I recently started creating my dream game in Unity with almost no game dev experience, after many years of daydreaming about the project. And, well, apparently I wasn't the only one thinking of new ideas during those many years, which I know, can you believe it? I figured this out while doing some research for my game's working name Manaborn and found that a book series named Manaborn now exists. And you might be thinking, Chris, you are literally on episode 2 of your devlog for this project, which in all likelihood will come crashing down around you before it's finished due to your lack of experience. Who cares about the name? Well, I do, I guess. I mean, this project is all about passion, and it's hard to feel passionate about something when you don't even know what to call it. Plus, the primary race of my player character that we introduced in the last episode was also going to be called the Manaborn, so I want to adjust their name before I sink more time into developing them. The player character's race will now be known as the Manaforged. I like this more anyways, as a comment from a recent video mentioned that the current player model kinda looks like a robot. I don't think that they are going to be robots, but I do like the idea of them being some type of construct that's powered by mana or something. And as for the game, the new working title is It Begins with Mana. However, I won't bother renaming any of my project files or folders or anything, as there is every chance that this name will change more during the development of the game. So there you go, devastating news shared. Now let's get on with episode 2 of this devlog. Today we are creating our first map, and to do this there are a few tasks that we'll need to complete. Number 1, we will need to create the assets for our background and platforms. Number 2, we will need to make it so that our camera follows our player. Number 3, we'll need to implement the background assets in Unity and make it so that they can parallax when we move. And number 4, our stretch goal will be making elements of our map, such as ropes, usable by the player. Now, before we get into these steps, it is worth discussing some of the research I did prior to creating the background assets. First and foremost, there are 2 primary directions that I could go in for creating the maps for my game. I could either create tile sets or hand-drawn assets. Both have advantages, but I decided to go with drawn assets, as one of my visual hooks was to have more of a Hollow Knight feel, which I believe the drawn assets will help me achieve. Once that decision was made, I watched a few videos from Gamecode Library, Danny, and Lost Relic Games about parallaxing to understand how I needed to create the background assets in order for them to be implemented with a parallax effect. The most important thing, which seems to be common to any art asset I've created for this game, is to ensure I separate the asset into different layers. I also watched several videos about how to create aesthetically pleasing environments from Thomas Brush, The Caicus, Nonsensical 2D, and Trent Kanuga. With a very basic level of understanding, I was ready to begin creating my background assets. So the first thing we needed to decide was which map we were going to start with in my game. Now currently, my game approaches maps and zones in a similar fashion to MapleStory, where each map is self-contained with portals to adjoining maps that the player can access. Moving from map to map through the portals helps you traverse across the zone and the world as a whole. Fortunately, I had already created a map of the first zone, the nursery, in one of my prior videos. This asset not only helped me establish the style of the various environmental pieces, but also helped me better imagine the layout of the first map we are tackling. The game starts in a tutorial zone called the Mana Caverns, and then progresses outside into the starting maps of the nursery. The first map right outside the Mana Caverns has an important NPC that I didn't feel like dealing with yet, so we just moved to the next map, which is beautifully named the Field East of the Caverns. As our game is in 2D, we need to imagine what part of the world our camera will be pointed at to capture the correct elements of the map. This pie slice provides an approximation of what we want to show in the first map, and has a nice mix of different environmental assets, including some plains, some trees, a bit of a mountain, and a bit of a hut. We can also see that there is a tree in front of the map that can be worked into the foreground. Moving into our Obsidian notes, we can explore some of the additional details I assigned to this map. In Obsidian, I have a different version of the nursery map that is far less aesthetically pleasing, but more functional. As you can see, I have all of the maps in the nursery zone laid out with arrows indicating how the player will flow between them. I even have nested maps for zones such as the Mana Caverns that are smaller zones within the overall nursery zone. The player will come out of the Mana Caverns into the cavern entrance map, which houses the NPC that we are skipping. And then the next map the player flows to is the field east of the cavern. We can hover over this map to see additional details that I have for it. This map contains some enemies but with a low density to discourage grinding and push the player to continue forward. It is primarily here to give a small breath between the interactions with the Mana Guardian and Sam the Novice NPCs. So, as we can see, there's actually not a lot happening in this map, and that is what makes it the perfect place for us to start creating our game's world. The last thing I prepared in my notes was creating an inspirational board for the map that I could reference during the drawing process. This board includes an image of the nursery, our small description of the map, some details about the enemies that would later be added to the map, and a bunch of reference screenshots from games that I wanted to be inspired by. Specifically, we have some screenshots from MapleStory, Hollow Knight, Yoshi's Island, and Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy. As with all of the assets that I've created for this game so far, I'm using Procreate to draw the assets for this map. However, this is the first asset that I'm creating without having a reference pencil sketch from my notebook, which is significantly more intimidating as we are again dealing with a blank canvas. With this in mind, I started creating a pencil sketch layer trying to capture all of the elements we highlighted initially in the 2D camera's pie slice of our map. This process was hard going, and the best piece of advice I can share is to just start. You will draw some things that you like and other things that you don't like. As you progress through the drawing, you will adjust the things you don't like to match the standards of the things you do like, and slowly, you will capture something workable. After the pencil sketch was done, it was time to render the elements of the scene in color with a black outline, which has been our style for all of the assets we've created so far. I spent the most time working on the platforms that the player would interact with, as I knew these had to be eye-catching and fairly detailed to help players understand that they could interact with them. Looking back at the process, I noticed that I kinda just guessed about platform height, which was kinda silly, but by having the assets as separate layers, I knew that some things could be adjusted in-engine if necessary. The rest of the scenes started to come together by following many of the principles that I learnt in the videos I watched as part of my research for this process. Namely, I ensured that I was using the same color palette as I did for the nursery map. I ensured that closer objects were bigger and darker, and that further objects got progressively smaller and lighter, and that the outline size remained consistent throughout the entire drawing. There were a few objects that gave me particular difficulty, as establishing their scale within the scene was really tricky. This primarily included the trees and to a larger extent the mountains. You'll notice that I reworked the mountain numerous times throughout this process as I battle with scale and the overall design of the mountain slope. One of the biggest assets in terms of establishing distance was introducing multiple bushes and clouds that could either be in front of or behind various objects. It's again important to note that all elements are being kept on separate layers, which not only helps with the creation of the full scene, but will also be crucial once the assets are in Unity. I should also note I was certain to make it so that all assets stretched all the way down to the bottom of the screen so that they had the ability to parallax vertically without exposing any holes in the scene. This is particularly noticeable with the hut that is drawn to be way taller than it would be represented in-game. Again, similar to the pencil sketch, you can see me experiment with a variety of different approaches to draw certain elements and then returning and adjusting things as I have new ideas. Throughout this entire process, I was continuously referencing the inspiration board I had created in my notes and the game art videos I mentioned earlier. Finally, we had a mountain that I was somewhat happy with and a scene that was almost complete. The last element I added were ropes that the player could use to climb up onto the platforms. Similar to the platforms themselves, the ropes were given additional detail to make sure that they popped off the screen for players. With all of the assets complete and ready to export, we could finally check off the first item on our to-do list. It was time to head to bed and prepare for the following day where we would bring our game to life. Now, we didn't start today's video with a peaceful montage and a long drawn-out monologue, but that doesn't mean that you've avoided one. I began the next morning by preparing a delicious breakfast for myself while wearing my phone strapped to my head, and don't worry, my wife thought it looked very cool. It was during the preparation of this meal that I contemplated the next steps of my journey and kept thinking back to the assets I'd created the day before. See, I was happy with them, but I kept having the urge to return and adjust little details, which you will see happen throughout the remainder of this episode at different times. But the biggest lesson I learned throughout this stretch of our game dev journey is to be okay with things not yet being perfect. I mean, at the end of the day, if this game does one day launch, I will have the time to go back and polish a variety of different items before we get to that point. At our current stage, I should be focused on learning and continuing to push forward with basic assets so that we can test out a prototype for the full game, not pursuing perfection. I feel like with everything we do, especially when it is public facing, there is an internal battle to make it absolutely perfect before sharing it. As an example, there was a moment during the creation of this breakfast montage where I considered cooking another egg as the first one's yolk was so off-center. I know it sounds crazy, but it wouldn't have been that hard to do, and it would have made the final composition more aesthetically pleasing. But it is these exact urges that I'm trying to avoid. This journey is about pursuing a dream and sharing the imperfected steps towards accomplishing it, and it is that mindset that I want to try and keep as we continue through the series. So it was finally time to open up Unity and get started with the next item on our to-do list, creating a camera that would follow our player. I started by watching tutorials from Game Dev Library, Sasquatch Bee Studios, and Ash Dev to learn how to achieve this using the Cinemachine Unity package. After ensuring that the Cinemachine package was installed into our Unity project, I went to work setting up the Cinemachine camera and adding our player as the tracking target. I did notice that the Cinemachine options we had in our project were different from the tutorials I was watching, and I assume this might be due to us using a newer version in Unity 6. Either way, after some fiddling with the settings, we had a camera following our player. However, our camera was showing too much below the scene, and our player sprite was jittering while moving. Repositioning the camera to hide the underneath of the platform was easy enough to solve, but the jittering player sprite would turn out to be a much more complicated problem. I did a significant amount of research about it throughout this episode, and it seems likely to have something to do with our player movement script and the way it's handling physics timing compared to our Cinemachine camera. In the end, a band-aid fix was to remove any sort of damping effect on the camera. This made our camera movements more sharp and jerky, but allowed the player's sprite to stop jittering. As mentioned before, the mindset was to push forward and not focus on perfection. There will be time in the future to focus on this issue as we add polish to our prototype. Before finishing with the camera, I added a dead zone so that the camera didn't need to move every time our player did, which also reduced the number of jerky camera movements we experienced. And there we go. Another task complete, and we had a camera that could follow our player. We were finally on to the third and most crucial task of today's video, importing the background assets we had created into Unity and implementing a parallaxing effect. The first step of this process was opening the assets in Krita to better organize all of the background layers and apply a Gaussian blur to the farthest assets to help give a greater illusion of distance. Once the layers were finalized, I exported each layer as a PNG file and imported them into our Unity project. I started by adding the sky layer to our scene as it was to be the backdrop for the whole map and would give us a good idea of size. I spent a lot of time adjusting the Texture 2D's import settings for this layer to try and get the sizing and quality of the assets to match our existing player. Once I found settings that I was happy with, I added the ground layer next and added a sorting layer so that it would render in front of the sky background. Beautiful. We were finally ready to graduate from the ground and walls that we'd been using in our previous episode, so I added physics to our new ground and removed the previous ground and wall game objects. However, I didn't initially set up the ground layer properly, and the physics worked, but our code didn't recognize the ground as ground, so we were perpetually jumping. An animation that we will find ourselves stuck in later in this episode as well. I adjusted the ground layer's settings and moved the camera's position down slightly, and we had a player that could walk on our new ground platform. It was also at this point that I tried fiddling with the Texture 2D's import settings for our player to see if it would be easier to adjust their size instead of the size of the background assets in the future. And I created this abomination. I tried reverting the settings that I had changed, but the rigging stayed messed up even after reverting the settings. It was at this moment that I was incredibly happy to be using GitHub, as I could simply go in and discard my changes. This did the trick, and I sighed with relief. Lesson learned, I won't fiddle with those settings after the rigging and animations have already been created for a sprite. After that near disaster, we returned to implementing different layers of the background, starting with more platforms, bushes, trees, and the hut, finishing with the mountain, the horizon, clouds, portals, and the foreground. Again, each of the layers received a different sorting layer to ensure that they were rendering in the right order once they were added to the scene. Finally, I was able to hit play and walk around in the scene I had drawn in Procreate the previous day, which again was such a surreal experience to bring a piece of my imagination to life. We committed these changes in GitHub and moved on to the second portion of this task, adding the parallaxing effect. I made repeat visits to Gamecode Library's tutorial on parallaxing to do this. I really can't say enough about how much this video helped me to implement this system. We created a new background controller script that would get the starting position of our background layers and move them horizontally based on the horizontal movement of our camera and the parallax effect variable that controlled the speed. At the moment, this script would only be handling horizontal movement, but it looked like it would be easy enough to adjust it for vertical movement in the future. It was also easier to fine-tune the horizontal movement first, separately, instead of trying to adjust the movement in both directions all at once. I went through and added the new script to the different layers of my scene that I wanted to have move and assigned them all separate parallax effect variables. Once everything was set, I hit play and we had a moving background, but also some adjustments to make. Most notably, we had a bush that was following us around the map, which looked super suspicious, and both the hut and the closest tree walked completely out of the scene. I removed the parallax script from the bush, the close tree, and the hut, as I deemed them close enough to the character to not move at all. I hit play again, and we had a scene that was moving horizontally with our character. However, you will likely have noticed that the edges of our scene were looking really rough, and because of that, I wasn't ready to call this task completed quite yet. The fix to this problem was actually something that should have been included in our previous step that was focused on the camera setup. We needed to set up bounds that would prevent our camera from seeing areas of the scene that we didn't want the player to see. To accomplish this, I watched a super quick tutorial from Ray Castley, which explained how to set up a Cinemachine Confiner 2D. This was actually very easy to do, as I could simply create an empty game object, add a box collider 2D, and size it to the area that I wanted to confine the camera to. Once created, we added this game object to the Cinemachine Confiner 2D, and voila, we had sort of a fence that kept our camera within its borders. This fence, however, would not keep our character within the scene, so I went ahead and created walls on either side of the scene to prevent the player from walking past the edge of the map. You might have also noticed that the implementation of the Cinemachine Confiner did lead to the return of our notorious player sprite jittering as we approached the camera bounds. Luckily, after having dealt with this earlier, I knew exactly what to look for in order to band-aid fix it. After turning the damping and slowing distance settings to 0 on the Cinemachine Confiner component, we no longer had any jitters. And just like that, we were 95% done, our third task on our list. We still needed to add vertical parallaxing, however, we first needed to be able to climb our ropes in order to make sure that the implementation of the vertical parallaxing was working. Which leads us to the fourth task, making elements of our background that the player could interact with. That said, I did make a quick pit stop before embarking on this final task to sprinkle a little bit more magic into our background. See, we had these portals on either end of the map that would lead players to the next map on the left or right side of the current map, but currently they were represented by static blue ovals. I wanted to try adding something animated to the background to make things a bit more lively, and I figured it wouldn't be too difficult to accomplish. Unlike the animations we did for the player character, the animation for these portals would be done using a sprite sheet animation. Essentially, I just needed to create several more frames of the existing portal to create a rudimentary animation for them. My initial version of this animation was done with the idea of having the borders of the portal fluctuate and the portal itself rise and fall to the ground. I created the frames in Procreate and imported them into the Unity project. Then, I simply needed to drop all of the frames into my project at once, and Unity would automatically create a new animation file for the sprites. And just like that, we had an animated portal. However, even after some adjustments to the keyframes, I found the rise and fall of the portal too abrupt and stayed with just having the portal borders fluctuate. I replaced the existing portals with these new animations, and we officially had some movement in our backgrounds. The animations weren't perfect, and even later in this episode I come back to adjust them, but it was nice to know that my idea of how to implement animated background elements was as simple as it seemed. With my initial portal experimentation behind us, we moved on to the fourth task on our to-do list, which of course started with consuming a tutorial. I watched a video from Bendux about making 2D ladders in Unity, which I hope translated fairly well to static ropes. We needed to add a new ladder movement script to our player, add a box collider 2D to our rope, and then adjust our rope's tag for the collision detection portion of our script to work. Essentially, the script is checking if our player is colliding with a rope, and if they are, our normal gravity is set to 0, and a new velocity can be applied to the player, moving them up or down the ladder. And as luck would have it, this is one of the few times that I implemented something without having any issues, or at least none that I didn't expect. I'm sure you'll notice right away how goofy our player looks climbing the rope, as we are essentially stuck in our jump animation while interacting with the rope. However, for the sake of time, adding a new climbing animation that will also require a new asset showing the back of our player will be pushed to a future video. The other issue, that is that the platform we are climbing to is just a sprite with no physics applied to it, is something that we will address in this video. So I went through the process of adding a box collider 2D to our platform much like we did for the ground level, and when I went to test it, it worked. It just wasn't letting us climb the rope through the bottom of the platform. It was at this point that I discovered that the platforms would need to be set up differently than our ground floor, allowing the player to pass through the bottom but not the top of the collider. As luck would have it, a lot of games require this, and there are a lot of systems in Unity built to handle one-way platforms. I learned about this feature through another Bendux video about 2D one-way platforms. This was actually a really easy change, as I simply needed to add a platform effector 2D component to the platform and enable the used by effector toggle on the platform's box collider 2D. Once this was done, we had it. We had a rope that could be climbed and a platform that could be passed through and then stood on. I spent a bit of time adjusting the speed of the rope climbing and the actual box collider 2D of the rope before I was satisfied, or at least satisfied with the rope. See, we could get onto the new platforms from below, but we had no way to drop down through the platform once we were on it, except for walking to the edges and dropping off. And as grinding enemies and map movement is going to be such a focus of my game, I wanted to be able to drop down through the platforms as well. Luckily, the same Bendux video about 2D one-way platforms also covered this feature, and I happily went about implementing it. We added another script to our player focused on interactions with one-way platforms. This script would again check if the player collides with something, this time specifically objects tagged as one-way platforms, and if so, it would collect that object as the current platform. Then, if the player pressed the S key or the down arrow key, And if the current platform was not null, it would start a coroutine that would disable the collision detection between the player and the platform for a specified length of time, a quarter second to begin. This worked, but the length of the disabled collision was not enough for the player to pass through initially, so I increased it to half a second and we had success. I also tried fiddling around with having the player need to press the S key or down arrow key in combination with the jump key to activate the down drop, but I could not get this to work easily, so we left it for the time being. This would only really become an issue if I had another use for the downward movement, like having the player be able to get into a prone state. I also bumped up the collision detection delay to 3/4 of a second to allow the player to climb back down the rope in a very janky but still effective way. I applied the changes we made to the initial platform and rope to the remaining platforms and ropes, and we had a map that our player could fully explore, which meant we were ready to deal with vertical parallax. As mentioned in my previous devlog episode, my typical learning process is to implement a system extremely guided by a tutorial for the first time around, but then try and be more independent in future iterations of the same mechanic. The addition of the vertical parallaxing after already having a working horizontal parallaxing system was the perfect use case for this process. I returned to the background controller script we had already created and made it so that all of the existing variables that were used for the horizontal parallax effect were denoted with an X. I then went through and added a second version of each of these variables denoted with a Y for the vertical movement, after which I replicated all of the calculations the script was making for the vertical axis. Lastly, I adjusted the transform position function to include our new Y variables, allowing the script to move in both the X and Y directions independently and with different speeds. I went back to my layers and now had a new parallax effect Y value to provide for each of them. To begin, I typically entered the same value as the parallax effect X value, as the same logic of having further objects move slower would still apply for vertical parallax as well. I gave it a try and we had success. We had a background full of elements that would expand as our character moved upward. I did need to make some adjustments, as not all of the layers needed the same parallax effect in both directions. Specifically, the foreground layer was moving too much and started to eventually disappear from the scene completely. I also noticed that the vertical parallax effect was very harsh when the player dropped down from a high point, as gravity moved the character very fast and then suddenly stopped them. However, this was not an issue with the parallax effect, but instead an issue resulting from our lack of damping and slowing effects on the Cinemachine camera. At the moment, we could choose between a harsh parallax effect when dropping, or constantly having a jittering character when moving. It was an easy choice. As mentioned earlier in the episode, we can't afford to perfect everything right away, and with that mindset in mind, I added this issue to a new list I created tracking all of the bugs or adjustments I hope to eventually make to the game. With vertical parallaxing added, we had officially completed our to-do list for this episode. However, there were still a couple of additional tweaks I wanted to make. Firstly, I wanted to experiment with having a larger view of the full map while playing. It took me a surprisingly long time to figure out how to make a larger view area with the camera, but I eventually found a setting that should achieve this in an Ash Dev tutorial. Increasing the lens setting allowed for a larger viewable area, and I played around with this value for a little while, settling on a slightly larger view compared to our starting point. Lastly, I also created some additional portal animations. The process to add them to the scene was just so easy, and I wasn't loving how messy the original portal animation I made looked. I created two new portal variants, one variant that used the same blue but had a cleaner shape and a less harsh rise and fall animation. The second variant was a different art style that used the same animation but showed an image of the map that the player would be transported to within it. The current image is what the portal that moves to this map would look like, as I don't have a finalized map for the maps to the left or right of this map to use. Ultimately, I decided to move forward with this third variant of the portal because I think it will be cool to have a visualization of where you are moving to. But I will continue to refine it with additional effects and more frames for a smoother animation. And with all of that, I was finally happy to close this chapter of our devlog. We had a significantly nicer environment for our player to explore than the simple green floor, white sky, and gray walls that we started with. I believe in the next episode, we are going to focus on adding our first enemies to our game, giving our players something to actually do, or at least avoid. Thanks again for joining me on this journey. I've truly been blown away by all the support this series has received since its launch at the start of the year. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider tossing the video a like and subscribing to the channel to keep following along. And if you have any recommendations on how to improve the code or visual assets we worked on in this episode, please share them in the comments. I really enjoyed all of the tips people shared in the last episode. Thanks for watching. Bye.